Welcome to Sports Car Market's Buy, Sell, Hold. I'm Keith Martin, the publisher of Sports Car Market, and I'll be your host today. With me is collector car expert Philip Richter. Hello, Philip.
Hey, Keith.
And we're going to talk about a car from the 80s today. It's a Mercedes 190E 16 valve. Philip, are you ready?
I'm ready, Keith.
And off we go. Philip, today we're going to talk about a Mercedes from the 80s and the 90s, the 190E 16 valve. It's kind of a stealth car because at its heart, it's a C-Class. Now, I was there when they launched the C-Class, and we joked that they called it C-Class because it had a cup holder, Mercedes' first ever cup holder. The 190E is a little more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a lot more than that. It's a true driver's car.
What are the origins of that car?
So it's a long story. It's fascinating. I'll make it succinct. But basically, Mercedes in the late '70s became wildly successful, and the brand was adopted as really the gold standard of luxury automobiles. And they wanted to capture a younger demographic, so they began development of what they called the W201 platform, which was the 190E platform. That car went into development and was launched in, I believe, 1983 here in the U.S. It was designed by Bruno Sacco, who was the great designer at Mercedes in that period. And it was really a baby Benz, not so much just for people who couldn't afford an S-Class, but for younger people who wanted a more nimble, exciting car. And so that was sort of the origins of the 190 class, which then morphed into a performance version, which was a very limited production car, the 190E 16 valve. And that was actually a function of an initiative at Mercedes-Benz to compete against Audi and later, ultimately, BMW in the DTM series.
Who was the initial buyer for the 190?
Well, here in the United States, they only imported just over 1,900 units between 1986 and 1987. And bear in mind, back then, the 190 16 valve was more expensive than an S-Class. So you can imagine the market for this car was very narrow. I mean, who on earth would buy a baby Benz at a price that's higher than the biggest luxurious S-Class of the model range? The buyer of this car was a real enthusiast. And these were people who wanted a high-revving, high-spirited manual transmission. This car actually you could order in a manual, although some of them came to the States in an automatic. Today, the manuals are far more collectible. But these were sold to enthusiasts, and many of these enthusiasts drove these cars. You will not find, it's very hard to find a low-mileage investment-grade U.S. spec 190 16 valve because they were driven. And they don't do well in the elements. Many of them were left in commuter parking lots outside of New York City, baking in the sun. The dials fade, the upholstery buckles. They do not do well in the elements. So it's become even a rarer car than the 1,900 units that were imported.
How much does the fact that it visually is so similar to a regular C-Class hold back its value and appeal?
Well, remember, this is the forerunner to the C-Class. This is the original baby Benz. The C-Class came later and really was the second generation of this market segment. But it's it's a spectacular car. The 190 16 valve really doesn't look like a normal E-Class or normal 190E. The naming conventions are complicated in this era because you had the 300E, which became the E-Class in that same era, 1986 forward. And then you had the 190E, but they ultimately said this is all too complicated, and that's when, to your point, we got to the C-Class. You had the S-Class, the E-Class, the C-Class, and that's how it is today. But the 190 16 valve had special bodywork and even a factory-installed rear wing, which made the car look very different than the normal 190E of the period.
Philip, what's it like when you drive this car hard, when you really hammer it?
It's awesome, Keith. You know, the adage, I think Miles Collier gets the credit for this one, but, you know, it's a lot more fun to drive a slow car fast than a fast car slowly. But it's a thrill, particularly the 5-speed. The transmission is, you know, as a race car, first is down, reverse is forward, and then it's a 5-speed. And it revs really well. This is a motor that basically Mercedes-Benz went outside of the company and got the help of Cosworth in England to design the 4-valve head, the 16-valve head, 4 valves per cylinder. And this thing revs. It revs hard, it loves to rev, and it actually makes quite a lot of power. The key to the 190 16-valve, there's a couple things that stand it apart. It's the power to weight ratio of the car is fantastic. I was driving mine yesterday, and even in modern traffic, the car is fast. If you really get on it, it'll get up and go. The other thing is the build quality. This is a true Mercedes-Benz of that era where the build quality is just completely unparalleled. This is also a car that began production really in the late, the US versions were built in the beginning of the late of 1985. And these are cars that came to the US with airbags and ABS brakes back then. So, you know, my car has a September 1985 build date. It has an airbag and anti-lock brakes, among a lot of other interesting features like seatbelt tensioners that pull you into the seats on impact and so forth. So the car's modern, it's well made, it revs high, it's fun to drive. I would argue I own an E30 M3, which is sort of the BMW's answer to the 190 16-valve. They race together in the DTM series, and they're a great pairing. I actually prefer the 190 to drive. It's more fun. It's more lively than the E30. It's also a third of the price right now in the market.
So, Philip, describe the potential buyer for this 190.
You know, I think the potential buyer for a 190 is somebody who is a real enthusiast who wants to own a production car that actually has race history. A lot of people don't know, but there was a race of champions that was held at the Nürburgring when they redesigned the track in 1984. And a young Brazilian race driver, who now obviously is a legend, Senna, was given one of the cars to drive in the race. I mean, he raced against John Surtees. He raced against Sterling Moss. It was sort of an amalgamation of all the greatest drivers that were alive at that moment got to all race in 190 16 valves around the Nürburgring. If you have the chance, it's on YouTube. You can search for it and watch it. But what you'll see is a young Senna flogging this car and being 5 to 10 car lengths ahead of the rest of the pack for the whole race. And I think the buyer of this car is someone who's a racing enthusiast who loves the fact that this little sleeping car, 4-cylinder, has this race history, which then the car later went on and raced in the DTM series very successfully. They boarded over to a 2.5 liter, and then they had Evolution series, Evo 1 and 2. And the car is really fun to drive. So the buyer is an enthusiast. The buyer is someone who probably knows about the race history of the car. The buyer is someone who wants a manual transmission, and the buyer is a collector who wants something that's low production. You are not going to see another 190 16-valve driving down the street today.
So, Philip, let's talk about this car and the market today. Buy, sell, hold. Is this a car that people are clamoring to buy? Is this a car that people just don't care about? Or is this a car that people are lining them up to get rid of them? Buy, sell, hold. Give us your opinion.
I think it's a strong buy. I think the market hasn't really woke up to this car yet. The market is on fire for the E30 M3. One sold on Bring a Trailer for $250,000 last fall. It was a fine car. It was very low mileage, but it wasn't the best one in the world. And the 190 16-valve can't seem to get that same respect, even though it's an identically comparable car and raced in the same series and has a similar pedigree. In fact, the E30 M3 exists because of the 190 16-valve. I would say that it's extremely undervalued by the market today. The problem with the 190 16-valve in the US, and obviously it's over 25 years old, so now they can be imported from Europe, but there were 1,900 cars were brought over. Most of them were used up. So there's not really investment grade 190s lying around. It took me 6 years to buy this car. So the market is not liquid and deep. if there were a lot of buyers, but the prices have stayed low, and I'm not sure if that's a function of the fact that there's just not a lot of product in the market to buy that's any good. There's a lot of 190 16 valves out there, but they're junk. They have high mileage, and they don't deal well with the elements, like I said. So I'd say it's a strong buy.
That's Philip Richter on SCM Buy Sell Hold, and on the Mercedes 190 16 valve, he is a solid buy. Thank you very much, Philip. Talk to you next time.
Thank you.